Hi everyone, welcome to Linked Over Lunch. My name is Nancy Nader and I'm the Director of Transition Services here at the Federation for Children with Special Needs, and I am with Kelley, Challen, the Director of Transition Services for NESCA. Today we are talking about the very important topic of transition assessment. It's a question that Kelley and I get all the time because it's kind of a gray area, and so we're going to try to provide you with as much information about it as we can over this 20-minute period. So I'm going to let Kelley talk a little bit about herself, and then we'll get started.
Right. So as Nancy said, I'm the Director of Transition Services at NESCA. And so I do oversee a team of transition specialists there.
Okay.
And we work with a large team of neuropsychologists. And so we provide a lot of transition assessment is definitely, I think, the main referral question for
Right.
people who come in to work with us. But we also do a lot of coaching and planning and working with school districts to design programming and things like that.
Right.
So all things transition.
Right. So let's get started with the basics. What is transition and when does it start?
Yeah, so transition, I think everybody's familiar with the word transition, and it's really just thinking about transitioning from one stage of life to another or one form to another. When we think about transition in relation to the IEP process, we're really talking about transitioning from being a student on an IEP to these emergent adult roles in things like independent living, in the community, employment, and potentially college or training or things like that.
Right.
Transition for students on IEPs is supposed to start at the age of 16 federally, but in Massachusetts, we're really lucky. We have strong protections.
Yes.
And so we expect that this process has started for students in the year that they're turning 14, in the IEP year that they're turning 14.
Right. So, transition is in IDEA, but what does it say about assessment?
So the lovely thing about the federal law is that it absolutely says that transition assessment needs to occur, and it needs to be age-appropriate transition assessment, and it doesn't talk much more about what that means.
Right, so it's gray, and that's why we're talking about it.
So it is gray. There is a very commonly accepted definition of transition assessment that comes from the Division of Career Development on Transition, which is from the Council of Exceptional Children, and so that really defines and says that it's an ongoing evaluation process, and we're looking at students' interests and preferences and needs, and then it's very specifically as they relate to the demands of current and future working, educational, living, personal, and social environments. So it sort of maps onto those areas that we're already thinking about transition planning for.
So I think the key word there is it's ongoing. It's not like one time a year we're going to assess this person and then we're going to make all the decisions from there.
Absolutely. You don't come in and have one transition assessment and know exactly what the plan's going to be for the rest of special education.
Right.
And at the same time, most students have already had something that counts as transition assessment because we're evaluating students on IEPs all the time.
Right. Or at least we should be. Right.
Absolutely.
So in your opinion, what are the most important things that parents and professionals should know about transition assessment?
So one of the things that I think is most important to understand about transition assessment is that even though transition is about planning for all domains of life, and we're thinking about how a student functions in a lot of different ways, you don't need to evaluate everything. If there's already good information about, how a student reads, we don't need to do that as part of a transition assessment.
Right.
If everyone agrees that this student is not safe to cross the street, you don't need to hire an evaluator to watch the student cross the street to determine that.
Right.
So you don't need to evaluate everything, and you don't just test kids for the sake of testing them. You really need to think through what are the areas that are, what do we already know about this student? What are they planning for after high school? What do they want to be doing after high school? And what then are the skills or questions we have to be able to create a solid plan for getting that student from where they are now to life after high school?
Right. So what's an example? What you and I were just talking about this, like going to college, like what would be an assessment around going to college?
Yeah, so There are some common things that I tend to look at for a student who's going to college. I mean, one important assessment might be the MCAS, right? Is the student going to actually obtain a diploma or not? That will impact what kinds of college programs they'd be looking at after high school. Going to college, then the SAT would also be an example of transition assessment. PSAT would be great information for that student. And I also tend to look at things like a student's executive functioning skills when they're heading off to college. When a student's heading to college, their academic levels are actually very important, sort of how well they're reading and writing. And even performing math is going to have an impact. So those are all things we tend to think about. And some of those you might have to request special assessments for, and some of those we already have data about.
Right. So that's something to think about when you're thinking about assessment. If you have that data, what other questions? You might have the academic data, but you might not have the executive functioning data. So that's the question. That's the information you're trying to pull from assessment.
A really important variable in transition planning that I think can be overlooked is something like transportation.
Right.
And when you think about a student who's going to college, I think about if this is a student who's going to live on a college campus, it's very different transportation and navigation skills than you need than a student who's going to live at home and actually has to get themselves to and from a community college.
Right.
In some cases, the transportation demands are more for the student who's not going to live there.
Right.
And that's really important to think about.
Right. And same with like independent people who maybe aren't going to go to college but want to live independently, their assessment is going to look totally different.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
And transportation assessment might look totally different as well for that kind of student. So these are the questions that we're thinking about as we are, deciding what kind of assessment we want to do.
Right.
So who is qualified to perform transition assessment?
People ask that all the time, right? Who should I request do this evaluation? And again, I wish it was a very clean-cut answer, but it does have to do with exactly what skills we're asking someone to evaluate. So there are many people in the public school setting who are all qualified to participate in different parts of transition assessment or even in comprehensive transition assessments.
Right.
If we think about something like travel skills, often, an occupational therapist is a great person to be evaluating some of those skills more functionally.
Right.
But if we're talking about taking a more global look at life skills, oftentimes a classroom teacher or maybe the school psychologist or anybody who's familiar with some of the formal and informal testing tools that we use for that would be qualified to be evaluating that. Right.
You just kind of have to know the questions that you want answered, right? That drives the assessment.
You need to be really specific with your referral question. I think it can be very challenging if you just say, I want transition assessment, without providing more information about what areas are we wondering about? What are the questions? What are your worries? What are you most concerned about that you don't already have information about?
Right. So I used to do vocational evaluation, and transitioning students would come see me, and some of them would be blank, no referral questions. So they just got a general one. This is what I think is important for work, but I don't really know the student. So if you have a student who wants to, their vision is working after high school, can they work 2 hours straight? Do they ask follow-up questions? So those are the kinds of things that's going to get you the information from your transition assessment.
Well, and I can even think about sitting with a family at the end of an evaluation yesterday, and then the parent said, well, I'm really concerned about the student's understanding of sexual health. And that is something that I do tend to evaluate for many students, at least on a screening level, right? But if that wasn't asked at the beginning of a referral process, you could definitely get a transition assessment without digging in and figuring out about a student's knowledge in that area. At the same time, if a student participated in a health class and passed exams and was active in discussions, you might already have information about their knowledge.
Right. That's great. So I think another question that we get a lot is, when do you need consent?
So we were just discussing this, which is why I'm laughing a little bit. But, if we think about what the federal law says, it really only says consent's needed if we're looking at something like IEP eligibility or re-eligibility. But I think what's more commonly accepted as thinking around when consent is needed is if it's a test that's only being given to your child, your student, and especially if it's a formal assessment measure and not something just informal like observing in the cafeteria while they're already eating lunch like they normally do.
Right.
If it's a formal test and it's only being given to one student, that's a good signal that consent might be needed. But the reality is we want transition assessment to be happening without explicit consent all the time, and it is happening. Right. The examples like the MCAS or even taking final exams for classes, teachers observing students that they work with closely, all of these things can be transition assessment. As parents at home, you're observing your child, and the knowledge that you bring in is a form of transition assessment, especially if that's then reported in an interview format.
Right.
Consent's, I think, needed in fewer situations than the total number of situations where evaluations might be happening.
Right. So let's talk about this question. How would a parent or a professional working with a student know if they had a good transition assessment?
Right. So as we were talking about, there's these different areas that we think about planning for after high school. So we're thinking about employment, we're thinking about, readiness for college or training experiences, we're thinking about independent living. If at the end of an assessment you have information in all of those areas about sort of the student's interests and preferences and their needs in those areas, then that's one sign that you've had a good transition assessment, that it's touching on all areas. That doesn't mean that every area was evaluated thoroughly, but at least should have been covered in the student interview or interview with the family or something like that. Another sign that you had good assessment is that the data came from multiple places, right? So we tested the student directly and got their the information that they could provide in whatever manner they could, but also that parents were part of the assessment process and that we use some measures to get parent information. And again, that can be interview or it can be formal kinds of questionnaires, things like that. And then we also want to make sure that school staff were involved. School staff are working with the student the highest number of hours per week. So the information that they have about students is really important. And if there are other providers who are familiar with the student or even family members who are familiar with the student on a regular basis, then getting data from those people would be important too. So it does have to do with data coming from multiple sources and also data that considers how the student functions in multiple environments. So we shouldn't come out of the assessment only knowing how the student performs in the school environment unless that was specifically the question that we were wondering about right then, right? Does the student have the classroom skills to sit in a college classroom? Maybe we would answer that just with school-based data.
Right.
But there's, you would want to have multiple people providing input and then thinking about the student across settings.
Right.
Yeah.
So Kelly, let me ask you, I think this is a question that I get a lot. And I think this kind of goes back to don't just test to test. So, you do have options and we want all this information. How do you narrow down what you're looking for? Like, what is your advice to parents when, you have this whole life you're looking at, you're looking at this whole life you're trying to help someone plan in high school. So how do you talk to them about narrowing down what they're looking for?
Well, it's funny. I know sometimes when you're sitting in an IEP meeting, the team is thinking about, 1 year from now, how will we know if we've accomplished everything we've set out to do in this IEP, right? And I think that's a really reasonable question to ask when you're setting goals for 1 year. When we think about transition, what we're talking about is what are our expectations at the time this student exits public education, exits their high school, things like that. So start there and narrow in on, okay, where is this student going to live? What is the student going to be doing throughout their day? What kinds of meaningful activities are they going to be doing throughout their day? If employment is part of that, where are they going to work? Is it one job? Is it more than one job? Things like that. You really have to think carefully through those questions, and then it does become easier to narrow down what kinds of tests you need. If a student is going to live at home, then it might be reasonable to think about cooking skills that they would need in a traditional home kitchen. If they're going to be living in a dorm environment, we don't need to think about that. So you do have to have your some of the goals that we're aiming for in mind when you pick out the assessments or when you're requesting assessments for your child. I do also think if if there's something that a parent or a teacher is really concerned about for that child, and we haven't evaluated that thoroughly, that's another place to narrow in on.
Right.
You know, I'm just really worried about safety skills in the community. Well, do we have any information about that so far?
Right.
You know,
besides from home,
Right.
where, you know, they might be more limited.
Or also, you know, in a large group with multiple staff is
Right.
different than walking around in the community on your own or with a smaller group.
Right.
So I think I know that can seem daunting, but it starts by really thinking about asking specific questions.
Right.
There are some good, what we call like transition planning assessment tools or transition planning inventories that do, again, sort of take a snapshot or a screening
Right.
of the different transition areas. And sometimes a tool like that is helpful, right? We have a vision, but we really don't know which skills are well developed or not well developed. And you can do a screening and then figure out, okay, here are all the areas that look like they might be areas of need. Which of these relate to the
Right.
goals after high school?
Right.
Just because it's an area that's not developed doesn't mean that, we have to work on all of those areas right now. It is thinking about, okay, does that relate to a skill that the student's going to need after high school? Should we be connecting them with an adult agency who
Right.
might, fill in that gap? And, or, is it skills that they would need to even access those resources? So there are ways to narrow it down.
Okay. And so you're thinking about like barriers and vision and future, right?
And strengths.
Right.
And strength. And that was interesting to me. I just reviewed, that sort of commonly accepted definition of transition assessment
Right.
from DCDT before we met, and that doesn't say strengths in it. But when we talk about transition planning for students, or when we think about, that strengths and key evaluation section of the IEP, I mean, planning for the future is supposed to be strength-based.
Right.
So if we're sitting with a student and we really don't know what are the strengths and aptitudes that we can build off of to be able to sort of build towards some meaningful life activities, then we need to really dig in with evaluation to figure that out.
Right.
That's just as important.
So many things to think about around something that seems so simple, assessment, but it really is complicated. When you like get down to the nuts and bolts of it, it has to be just individualized to the student you're working with.
It does have to be individualized to the student, and I think it requires a lot of good communication among with the student themselves and among all of the people working with the student. And that makes it a time intensive kind of a process too.
Right. And it should be over the year. This is the other thing that you and I were talking about, is making it, assessment should be occurring over the school year, the entire year. Right.
Not just, it certainly can happen as part of a 3-year reevaluation process.
Right.
But that's not the only time that you're evaluating something.
Right.
Oftentimes an outcome of a single shot transition assessment might be, these are things that we need to continue to evaluate over time.
Right.
Here are some ways that we might observe the student over time, or do a different trial, work trials, things like that. So it is an ongoing process. It's not just one shot.
Yeah. Great. Any other advice for parents and professionals out there around assessment?
Well, I think oftentimes people will come in and say, I'm doing this too late, right? You must get calls like that.
Yes.
I just heard about transition. I'm doing this too late. And I do just want to reassure you that every student who's on an IEP has had some form of transition assessment. And, every parent who has a child has started transition planning in some way, shape, or form.
Right. It just doesn't have that label on it. Transition assessment.
I think because this feels like a big, broad, scary topic, and yet these are things that we're doing on a daily basis, and you may just need to dig in a couple of places to be more focused as you're heading forward.
Thank you. So how can listeners get more information on assessment and NESCA?
So if it's information on transition assessment in general, I strongly recommend looking at the Department of Ed's website. There are some fabulous technical advisories that have come out of Department of Education. There was one in 2014 in particular that does a really nice job describing transition assessment. And I think, talks about some of the things like consent or what kinds of tests count, even links to, it links to a list of sort of recommended formal and informal assessments. Not recommended, but just so you have an understanding of what those different types of tools are. What I would not suggest is going through a whole list and saying, gee, I think my kid could use these 20 types of assessment,
Right.
if you don't know exactly what those assessment tools mean.
Right.
What I would suggest is really thinking about here are these areas that I know my child needs to have more independence than they do now, and I'm not sure if we have good information. Being more specific about what the concern is as opposed to the type of test you want can be helpful in conversation. And then NESCA, I mean, we have a website too.
We'll link to that too.
That'll be linked to this website, and we have a Facebook page and things like that. So there's lots of good information there. NESCA happens to have a blog that we put out every single Monday. And so there's plenty of information on there about transition assessment, transition resources, and things like that.
Great. And the Federation actually took that 2014 assessment advisory from the Department of Ed and made it into a simplified brochure. So I'll tag that along.
Yes, that is a fabulous brochure. And that, I think, a lot of the things that we've been talking about today in terms of, when do you need consent and what kinds of assessment count, those are all in that brochure. It's a really well done, simple resource.
Yeah, and you can print it and have it around with you if you want.
You can take it to your team meetings.
You can. All right, thank you so much.
Thanks, Nancy, for having me.
Thank you for joining us.